$200,000 gone in an instant. Just black, ash drifting lazily on the wind where my golden wheat field once stood, ripe and waiting for the combine. I stood there motionless, my worn boots sinking slightly into the still warm, scorched earth, watching thin gray columns of smoke rise and twist upward like the final, fading breaths of a dream I had nurtured for years. 40 acres of premium hard red winter wheat, 3 days from what should have been a record harvest, now looked like a battlefield after heavy artillery, blackened stubble stretching under the harsh Kansas sun that offered no mercy. The smell assaulted me in layers. First the sweet, almost caramelized char of burning grain, then the sharp, chemical bite of diesel accelerant, and beneath it all something far uglier, pure, calculated malice. This wasn't lightning or a stray cigarette. This was deliberate destruction of my retirement fund, my quiet therapy, my living connection to 3 generations of Blackwood farmers who had first broken this prairie soil back in 1952. Everything reduced to worthless carbon particles floating away on the breeze. But the true rage, the kind that made my hands tremble and my vision narrow, came from what I saw 50 feet away across the property line that had long since become an invisible front in a Cold War. Delilah Prescott stood there calmly, garden hose in hand, directing a gentle stream of water onto her meticulously tended prize roses. She wasn't helping the firefighters who were still battling hot spots where the blaze had threatened to jump the road. Not a single drop went toward the flames that had just devoured my future. Every careful, precious spritz was reserved for those pampered bushes she treated like fragile children. The fire roared behind her, crackling and popping as it consumed the last standing stalks, and she turned toward me, raised one manicured hand in a casual wave, and actually smiled, a small, tight, satisfied curve of red lips. "Sorry about your little crop problem," she called out, her voice carrying clearly over the dying crackle of the fire, as though she were commenting on a minor inconvenience. A spilled drink, a delayed package, nothing more. Little crop problem. After 2 full years of relentless harassment, anonymous complaints, certified letters from lawyers, forged roadblocks, chemical sabotage that had already killed 3 acres, and now this final, blazing act of arson that could have ended my family's legacy forever. What she didn't know, what she could not possibly have imagined as she stood there watering her flowers while my world turned to ash, was simple. I wasn't merely some stubborn, aging farmer clinging to his dirt out of sentiment. I was Judge Ezra Blackwood, the man who spent 5 days a week behind the heavy oak bench in the Millfield County Courthouse, presiding over agricultural disputes, property battles, drift damage claims, and the endless friction between century-old farms and brand-new subdivisions. Come Monday morning, this smug, rose-watering arsonist would walk through the courthouse doors and find herself seated as the defendant in my courtroom, facing charges she had no idea were already being meticulously assembled. What would you have done in that exact moment, standing on blackened ground, staring at the woman who had just set fire to your life's work while she casually tended her garden? Would you have shouted, crossed the line, and confronted her, or held every ounce of fury inside and let the wheels of justice turn at their own deliberate speed? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, Rahim Khan in Punjab, or somewhere else on the map. Justice, I promise you, was already on its way, moving slow and unstoppable like a harvest combine after a long, parched summer. To understand how we reached that smoking field, you have to go back to the quiet beginnings of the war. My name is Ezra Blackwood, and for most of my adult life, I've lived what people might call a split existence. From Monday through Friday, I'm in the courthouse, black judicial robe over my shoulders, listening to neighbors argue over water rights, fence lines, herbicide drift that kills a neighbor's crop, and the constant push-pull between heritage agriculture and creeping suburban development. I've written opinions and handed down rulings in hundreds of cases eerily similar to the one Delilah Prescott would eventually force upon me. But on weekends and in the long evenings after court adjourns, I'm out in the fields, knee-deep in the same rich Kansas dirt my grandfather first turned over with a horse-drawn plow in 1952. The 200 acres came to me fully when my wife Sarah passed from cancer 2 years earlier. She always said the farm was my therapy, and she was absolutely right. After 12 straight hours of hearing other people's anger, grief, greed, and desperation echo off courtroom walls, there was something almost sacred about walking through waist-high wheat as the evening breeze moved through it like a soft sigh. The smell of freshly turned earth blending with the faint tang of diesel from the idling tractor, the steady crunch of gravel under work boots. It anchored me when Sarah's illness threatened to pull everything under. Then the developers arrived, hungry and fast. Prairie estates sprang up practically overnight. 47 nearly identical houses, identical lawns clipped to the same height, identical complaints about anything that reminded the newcomers they had moved next to actual working land instead of a manicured park. Most of the residents were good people, families fleeing city noise, retirees seeking open sky, young couples who wanted room for children to run. They got the quiet, the big horizons, and the unexpected gift of living beside real agriculture. But every new development has at least one resident who cannot leave the city behind. The person who flees controlled suburban life only to spend every waking hour trying to recreate it in the countryside. That person was Delilah Prescott. She arrived from Orange County, California, driving a pristine white BMW that had obviously never seen real mud. 52 years old, blonde in the expensive, salon-maintained shade that never shows roots, armed with strong opinions about everything from the color of mailboxes to the acceptable length of grass. Within 6 months, she had maneuvered, charmed, and outspent her way to HOA president, campaigning on a promise to elevate property values through proper community standards. Everyone understood the translation. Make the farm next door disappear, silence the early morning tractors, eliminate the dust that sometimes drifted on the wind, erase every sight, sound, and smell that proved this place had been rural long before her gated streets were paved. The campaign of harassment began quietly but grew with terrifying precision. First, it was the rooster, my grandfather's old bird that had crowed at dawn for decades, suddenly labeled severe noise pollution. Then the combine harvester became a rolling public nuisance because dust clouds might threaten children's respiratory health. Irrigation sprinklers were accused of creating dangerous mosquito breeding grounds that endangered the whole community. Never mind that her own adult children lived in Denver and hadn't set foot on the property in years. Inconvenient facts never slowed Delilah. I tried the neighborly approach at first. I carried over baskets of fresh sweet corn from my vegetable patch, sat on her spotless front porch, and patiently explained crop rotation, why equipment sometimes runs before sunrise or after sunset, depending on dew and heat, and how I would happily adjust harvest timing around her garden parties if she gave me reasonable notice. She accepted the corn with a smile cold enough to frost glass in July, then filed 3 additional formal complaints before the week was out. From there, the escalation became almost surgical. Petitions demanded 12-foot agricultural screening fences around my entire boundary to hide the visual blight of farming equipment and growing crops. Proposed noise ordinances targeted any machinery operating outside reasonable residential hours. Environmental impact studies were demanded for fertilizer and pesticide applications, each study requiring expensive third-party consultants and months of delay that could easily kill a harvest window. Every few weeks, another thick packet arrived via certified mail from lawyers she retained using HOA dues, demands that I cease operations that had existed on this land for generations before she was born. Her boldest legal move came when she discovered the easement my grandfather had wisely secured back in 1974 during the county road expansion. He had negotiated permanent, irrevocable agricultural access right straight through what later became Prairie Estates. The document was bulletproof. No revocation, no modification, no blockage allowed under any circumstances. When her attorney failed to invalidate it in court, Delilah abandoned the legal route and turned to outright sabotage. One Tuesday morning, I hooked the combine to the trailer to move it to the North 40 and found the legal access lane completely blocked by enormous decorative boulders. expensive landscape features that perfectly matched the stonework around her own house. She had hired a crew, paid in cash, and had them installed under cover of darkness. I called the sheriff within the hour. Delilah produced a forged work order claiming the boulders were traffic calming measures urgently requested by residents. The sheriff recognized the fraud immediately, but without video or independent witnesses, his hands were tied. Standing in the blistering heat, sweat already running down my back from rage more than temperature, I understood at last that this was no longer about aesthetics or property values. This was total war, declared on my family's history, on Sarah's memory, on the sanity I had fought to preserve, and Delilah believed her bank account and HOA title rendered her invincible. She had no idea who she had chosen as her enemy. 15 years on the agricultural law bench had taught me exactly how bullies who abuse power eventually destroy themselves. All it takes is patience, evidence, and perfect timing. 2 months before harvest, I woke to the unmistakable stench of chemical warfare drifting across my land. A 3-acre strip hugging the property line had turned from green to a sickly, twisted brown overnight. Not the warm gold of ripening heads, but the necrotic collapse of plants poisoned at the root. The air smelled sharply of industrial herbicide, stinging my eyes and throat as I walked the dead-straight damage line. 3 acres, roughly $12,000 of premium wheat, dead before it could be cut. The timing was surgical. The night before, Delilah had contracted Premier Landscape Solutions for aggressive invasive weed management along her boundary. Strangely, her weeds had required the strongest restricted-use herbicide on the single windiest day of the entire month. I phoned my crop insurance adjuster, Rick, a man who had documented everything from hail annihilation to blatant fraud attempts. Together we walked the kill zone, measuring drift vectors, photographing scorch patterns, pulling soil cores. The pattern was textbook. You could draw an arrow straight line from her sprayer booms to my ruined rows, showing precisely where the chemical plume had ridden 25-mile-per-hour gusts out of the west. This wasn't accidental, Rick said, crouching in the brittle stubble. No licensed applicator in their right mind sprays restricted material on a day with that wind, unless drift is the goal. Proving criminal intent would be the hardest part, but years of rulings had taught me the civil liability rule most people ignore. The property owner who orders the application remains financially responsible for drift damage regardless of whether the contractor was negligent or the wind unexpected. The man holding the sprayer might face license suspension, but Delilah would pay for every ruined stock if I could demonstrate she knew, or should have known, the risk. I began documenting with military discipline. Military-grade trail cameras, 4K resolution, night vision, motion-triggered, went up along the entire fence line. If she wanted to wage shadow war, I would record every move in high definition. The investment paid dividends faster than anticipated. 2 weeks later, late at night with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, I reviewed footage and felt my pulse hammer. There she stood on the night of the spraying, framed in her illuminated back doorway, like a general surveying a battlefield. The audio was startlingly clear in the still evening air. Make sure you get right up to the fence line. Those weeds are really problematic right there. The contractor's voice came hesitant. Ma'am, wind's pretty strong tonight. Might drift onto your neighbor's crop. Delilah cut him off with the impatient tone of someone accustomed to obedience. I'm sure you know what you're doing. I'm paying you to solve my weed problem, not deliver weather reports. He shrugged, adjusted the boom, and directed the spray directly at my boundary. I burned 3 encrypted copies of the clip on separate drives and locked them in my office safe, but I filed no charges. The strongest cases are built by letting the opponent keep digging their own grave while you collect every shovelful of evidence. The herbicide attack produced an unexpected ripple effect. Other prairie estates residents began approaching me quietly, almost furtively, with their own stories of petty tyranny. Delilah's enforcement zeal wasn't reserved for agriculture. Families have been fined for trampolines deemed visually disruptive. Liens were threatened over backyard vegetable gardens that failed to meet appropriate suburban landscaping standards. She even attempted to ban American flags for being excessively large and militaristic. Mrs. Aurora, a retired schoolteacher whose fingernails still carried permanent garden dirt after 40 years of tending flowers, showed me a stack of 17 violation notices for her butterfly garden. The scent of her lavender and marigolds brought Sarah's old flower beds back so sharply I had to look away. Mr. Rodriguez received a $300 fine for parking his work truck in his own driveway overnight. The Peterson children were forbidden a basketball hoop because repetitive bouncing violated community acoustic standards. I understood then that my fight had grown larger than one farm. I had become, reluctantly, the visible symbol of resistance against a small-scale despot who believed her HOA title granted her dominion over every life touching hers. Delilah must have felt the ground shifting beneath her, because she escalated once more, this time with full legal theater designed to crush through expense and delay. 3 weeks after the chemical kill, a thick certified letter arrived from Blackstone and Associates, a high-end Kansas City environmental law firm. 8 pages of elegant accusations: groundwater contamination from excessive fertilizer applications, degradation of regional air quality by agricultural dust, destruction of wildlife habitat through monoculture practices. The demand at the end was brutally simple: cease all farming operations immediately pending a comprehensive environmental impact study, conveniently projected to cost $40,000 and take 6 months, timed perfectly to obliterate the entire harvest season. I had watched this playbook from the bench countless times. Drown the target in procedural costs until financial pressure forces surrender. Amateur move. By pushing this far, she had crossed the invisible line into what Kansas statutes define as agricultural terrorism: any intentional act or pattern designed to disrupt or destroy lawful farming through intimidation, economic sabotage, or property damage. Federal sentencing guidelines began at 10 years. Still, I kept silent. The best trap is the one your enemy builds for herself while you watch and record. 3 weeks later, she unveiled her most vicious gambit yet, using the HOA board to ram through agricultural equipment curfew ordinances. Identical certified letters landed in every Prairie Estates mailbox like legal fragmentation grenades. Whereas excessive noise from commercial agricultural operations disrupts the peaceful residential enjoyment to which all members are entitled, the text declared, the association hereby establishes mandatory equipment curfews. No machinery shall operate before 9 a.m. or after 5 p.m. Violations subject to $500 daily fines and immediate placement of liens on the offending property. The sheer malice was almost admirable in its precision. Harvest does not observe office hours. When a perfect weather window opens, low humidity, dry fields, no rain forecast, you move, dawn to dusk, if necessary. Morning dew must burn off before cutting can begin. Evening humidity can spike and ruin grain quality in hours. A strict 9 to 5 rule would make commercial harvest mathematically impossible. The emergency board meeting to ratify the ordinance was scheduled for Thursday evening in the Prairie Estates Clubhouse, a low beige building that always smelled faintly of industrial carpet shampoo and quiet disappointment. Delilah had imported her ace in the hole, a so-called agricultural noise expert flown in from Topeka at HOA expense. I considered skipping the meeting altogether. Then I remembered something Sarah used to say whenever we discussed bullies. Sometimes you fight fire with fire, sometimes you fight it with law books and perfect timing. Thursday ran long in court, a complicated water rights dispute that refused to settle. I drove straight from the courthouse to the clubhouse, still wearing my judicial robes, the heavy black polyester holding the day's accumulated heat like a second skin. Gravel crunched under my dress shoes as I approached the building. Delilah's voice already carried through the thin walls, strident and preacher-like. I waited until she hit her crescendo. And this certified expert will now demonstrate why agricultural noise pollution constitutes a clear and present danger requiring immediate municipal intervention before opening the door. Her voice cut off as though someone had pulled the plug on a microphone. 43 heads turned in unison toward the rear entrance where a black-robed judge had suddenly appeared. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like trapped insects. The room filled instantly with the thick silence that follows a thunderclap, undercut only by the faint smell of overbrewed coffee left too long on the warmer. "Good evening, neighbors," I said in my most pleasant courtroom tone, taking a folding chair in the very back row. "Please don't mind me. I'm simply here as a concerned property owner." Delilah's face went through a rapid sequence of colors. Shock white, then flushed red, then something close to purple, before she forced a smile that looked painted on. She recovered faster than most defendants I'd seen on the stand. "Judge Blackwood, what a pleasant surprise. We were just discussing community noise standards that would benefit every resident." "I'm sure you were." I gave her the slow, patient smile I reserve for overconfident lawyers who think they've already won. "Please continue with your expert testimony." The expert, her brother-in-law Rick, a timeshare salesman from Orange County posing as an acoustics authority, stumbled through 20 minutes of fabricated statistics about decibel thresholds and acoustic trauma exposure. I took careful notes, partly to build the record, partly because watching him sweat through his inexpensive suit was more compelling than most television. When he finally sat down, I rose. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Fascinating presentation," I said, glancing at my notes. "Quick question for the witness. Are you familiar with the Kansas Right to Farm Act, specifically Statute 2 to 3201? Rick blinked rapidly. "Well, my expertise lies more in the field of acoustic science. Let me help educate the room." I pulled out my phone and read the relevant section aloud in a calm, measured voice. "Agricultural operations conducted on agricultural land shall not be deemed a nuisance if the operation has been in existence for 1 year or more and was not a nuisance when it began." I looked slowly around the room. My family's farm has operated continuously on this land since 1952. That is 71 years of protected activity. 15 years ruling on agricultural law cases had drilled the statute into muscle memory. Every state has right to farm legislation for exactly this scenario. Newcomers purchase homes next to long-established operations, then attempt to use local ordinances and nuisance claims to shut them down. Kansas goes further, explicitly prohibiting any local rule that interferes with normal farming practices. Harvest timing is dictated by weather and crop physiology, not neighborhood association meetings. Mrs. Aurora's hand shot up like a student who finally understood the lesson. "So this proposed curfew is actually illegal. Any attempt to restrict lawful agricultural operations protected under state statute exposes the HOA to civil liability and potentially criminal charges under Kansas agricultural interference laws. Those carry significant penalties." I looked directly at Delilah. The room erupted in low murmurs and shuffling chairs. 3 families stood and walked out immediately. The Petersons publicly withdrew their earlier support for the ordinance. Mr. Rodriguez asked pointed questions about protecting his work truck from future harassment. Delilah pounded her gavel repeatedly, but the momentum had shattered. Her carefully assembled coalition collapsed faster than week-old cornbread. As I walked to my truck, gravel crunching underfoot, I caught the tail end of her frantic phone call through an open window. The agriculture angle backfired completely. "We need to get creative. Maybe something more personal." I allowed myself a small, private smile. Sometimes the most powerful defense is simply knowing the law better than the person trying to weaponize it against you. But her parting words made one thing perfectly clear. She wasn't retreating. She was only changing weapons.